On the morning of August 29, 2015, a quiet house on Henson Street in Bristol suddenly became the scene of a horrific crime. 3 generations of a family were going about their normal lives when gunshots suddenly rang out. The terrifying thing was that the gunshots didn't come from outside or from an intruder, but from within the house, where everyone knew each other. 3 adults were shot dead, and 6 children witnessed the family's destruction. When the police arrived, they found a cold, silent scene, with no signs of struggle or escape. A profound silence prevailed after the gunshots. Clearly, this was no random incident. The danger didn't come from outside, but had been simmering within the family, waiting for the moment to explode. The perpetrator was a family member, only 19 years old. This story is not just about a bloody morning, but also about invisible cracks, how they grow silently and destroy everything in an instant. At first glance, the house on Henson Road in Bristol, Tennessee, didn't appear to be a crime scene. It seemed like a normal, quiet, and occupied home. On the morning of August 29, 2015, the day began peacefully, with no alarms, disturbances, or emergency calls reported. The investigation file indicated that several family members were inside, going about their usual routines. They were having breakfast, talking, and the children were awake while the adults were present. Nothing initially indicated that this ordinary morning would shatter so many lives. That house held 3 generations: a mother, Toshya Millhorn, a stepfather, James Millhorn, and a grandmother, Lena Rose. They lived together not just because they were family, but because they were together every day. This wasn't a temporary living situation. It felt like a permanent home. It was the kind of place where children memorized the rooms and knew the familiar sounds. This stability would later make any disruption feel even more devastating. At some point that morning, gunfire broke the routine. According to court records, shots were fired inside the home. 3 adults were struck. All 3 would later be pronounced dead from gunshot wounds. The killings did not happen in isolation. 6 children were inside the residence at the time. Several of them witnessed the shootings. That fact alone would shape the entire investigation, not just legally, but morally. The crime was no longer only about who died. It was about who saw. Police would later describe the scene as contained but devastating. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication of an outside intruder. According to investigators, the violence unfolded quickly, in close quarters, among people who knew each other. The absence of struggle marks or defensive wounds suggested little warning. The gunshots were the first signal that something was wrong, not chaotic, but stunned. The kind of stillness that follows sudden violence. Children were present, alive, and physically unharmed, but visibly traumatized. The weight of what they had just seen lingered in the rooms. It would not leave easily. Within hours, the question facing investigators was unavoidable. This was not a random act. It did not arrive from outside. The danger came from within the family structure itself. Before the gunshots, the family on Henson Road was known in fragments, not headlines. According to public records and testimony later presented in court, this was a blended household shaped by adjustment rather than instability. Toshya was raising her children with structure and routine. James Millhorn, her husband, worked steadily and was described by relatives as protective and engaged. Lena Rose, Toshya's mother, lived in the home as well, helping with childcare and daily life. 3 generations under one roof, not unusual in a town like Bristol. Robert Seth Denton was part of that structure. 19 years old at the time, he was Toshya's son from a previous relationship. By most outward measures, he was not living on the margins of society. He had grown up in this environment. He knew the rhythms of the house, the habits of the people inside it. According to the investigation file, there were no active restraining orders, no recent police calls for domestic violence, and no documented threats reported in the weeks leading up to the killings. But the absence of records does not mean the absence of tension. Testimony later revealed that Denton had ongoing conflicts with family members. Arguments over discipline, authority, and control surfaced in witness statements. He was described as increasingly withdrawn, resistant to rules, and prone to anger when confronted. These were not dramatic warning signs. They were familiar ones, the kind families often manage privately, believing time will soften them. Emotionally, the household lived in a state of quiet strain. Not constant conflict, but unresolved friction. The adults maintained responsibility. The children followed the routine. Beneath that surface, however, relationships were shifting. Authority was being challenged. Boundaries were being tested. According to court testimony, some family members had begun to feel uneasy, though no one articulated fear of lethal violence. What makes this phase difficult to examine is its normality. There were no clear countdowns, no written plans, no explicit declarations of intent were found by investigators. The family believed they were navigating a difficult transition, not approaching catastrophe. That belief would later haunt the surviving relatives. In hindsight, prosecutors would argue that the warning signs were behavioral, not procedural. A pattern of resentment, escalating defiance, a sense, according to expert testimony, of perceived grievance and loss of control. But hindsight is a sharp tool. It cuts more clearly after the damage is done. As investigators later reviewed interviews and timelines, one realization began to solidify. The violence did not erupt from nowhere. It grew quietly, inside familiar walls, unnoticed until it was irreversible. When officers arrived at the Henson Road house, the violence was over. Police reports and court testimony describe a silent, still house. Not empty, but frozen in time. Inside, they found 3 adults dead from gunshot wounds: Toshya, James, and Lena Rose. Their bodies were close together, indicating the shootings happened quickly, one after another. There was no sign of a break-in, and no indication that the killer had escaped outward. All evidence suggested the violence originated and ended within the house. Investigators moved carefully. They secured the home, separated witnesses, and began documenting what could be seen and measured. Shell casings were recovered. A firearm was identified as the murder weapon and was later linked through forensic examination. Bloodstain patterns indicated the victims were shot at close range. According to the investigation file, there were no signs of a prolonged struggle. The shots appeared deliberate, controlled, final. The most critical evidence, however, did not come from the floor or the walls. It came from the children. 6 minors were inside the house at the time of the shootings. Several of them witnessed the killings directly. Their statements, later described in court as consistent and immediate, placed Robert Seth Denton at the center of the violence. According to testimony, the children identified him as the shooter. Their accounts described a sequence of events that matched the physical evidence recovered at the scene. First responders described children in shock, some crying, others silent. There was no confusion about what they had seen, only disbelief. These were not distant witnesses. They were family members, watching their world collapse from inside it. Investigators would later say that interviewing the children was among the most difficult aspects of the case. From an investigative standpoint, the clarity of the scene narrowed the scope almost immediately. This was not a burglary gone wrong, not an unknown assailant. The crime unfolded in daylight, in a family home, witnessed by those who knew the shooter personally. According to police records, there was no alternative suspect identified in the initial hours after the discovery. Detectives verified timelines. They corroborated statements. They tested forensic findings against witness accounts. Even when evidence appears overwhelming, it must still be proven, especially when the accused is a family member and the witnesses are children. As the scene was processed and the statements recorded, the investigation crossed a point of no return. The question was no longer who committed the crime. It was how it would be proven, and whether the evidence would hold when examined under the harsh light of a courtroom. In the hours after the shootings, the investigation moved quickly, but not recklessly. According to police records, Denton was taken into custody the same day. There was no pursuit, no public standoff. The decision was based on immediate witness statements, physical evidence recovered from the home, and Denton's presence at the scene. Even so, investigators treated the case as if it could still fracture under scrutiny. Detectives began by reconstructing the timeline. Who was awake? Who was in which room? When the first shot was fired, children's statements were cross-checked against one another, then compared with forensic findings. According to trial testimony, the accounts aligned in key details. The sequence of the shootings, the identity of the shooter, the location of each victim. Consistency became a form of corroboration. Forensic analysis added weight. Ballistics testing later confirmed that the bullets recovered from the victims were fired from the same weapon. Gunshot residue testing was conducted. According to the investigation file, the results were consistent with the shooter having discharged a firearm inside the home. The weapon itself was identified and secured. Its connection to Denton was established through testimony and physical proximity, though ownership details would later be debated by the defense. Officers were not chasing an unknown suspect across jurisdictions. They were documenting the collapse of a family. Interviews were quiet, methodical. Detectives later testified that Denton showed little visible emotion during questioning. He did not provide a detailed confession, nor did he offer an alternative explanation that shifted suspicion elsewhere. According to police, his responses were limited, controlled, and non-committal. As the days passed, prosecutors began assembling the case with precision. This was not a circumstantial puzzle. It was a direct evidence case built on eyewitness testimony, forensic confirmation, and the absence of any competing narrative. Still, the burden of proof remained absolute. The presence of child witnesses meant every statement had to be handled carefully, ethically, and defensibly. One investigative challenge remained: motive. Why would a 19-year-old kill his mother, stepfather, and grandmother? According to prosecutors, motive was not required for conviction, but it mattered for understanding intent. Investigators reviewed Denton's behavior, his recent conflicts, and his mental state. No formal diagnosis of severe mental illness was presented at the time of arrest. What emerged instead was a portrait of grievance, resentment, and escalating anger. By the time the case was formally charged as 3 counts of first-degree murder, uncertainty had narrowed into focus. The investigation had moved from shock to structure, from chaos to narrative. Everything now depended on whether that narrative could survive the trial. Denton's trial took place years after the event that devastated his family, but the shadow of August 29, 2015 loomed large in the courtroom. Court records show the trial focused on accountability, not on uncovering what happened. The facts of the case were established. The jury's task was to determine if the evidence met the required legal threshold and if Denton's intent could be proven without any reasonable doubt. Prosecutors presented a case built on structure and restraint. They began with the scene itself: photographs, ballistics reports, autopsy findings. Each victim died from gunshot wounds. The medical examiner testified that the injuries were consistent with close-range firing and that the deaths occurred within a short window of time. The physical evidence did not contradict itself. It reinforced a single narrative. The most difficult testimony came from the children. Their identities were protected, their voices filtered through careful questioning. According to trial transcripts, their accounts were clear, consistent, and emotionally controlled beyond their years. They described seeing Denton fire the weapon. They placed him in the rooms where the victims fell. There was no hesitation about recognition. This was not a stranger. This was family. The defense faced a narrow path. They did not present an alternative suspect. Instead, they focused on Denton's age, his emotional development, and his mental state. Arguments were made about impulse, immaturity, and alleged emotional instability. According to the defense, this was not a calculated act, but a tragic eruption. However, no formal insanity defense was entered. No expert testimony established legal incapacity at the time of the shootings. The victims' family members were present and remained calm and silent. They showed no emotional outbursts. Their grief seemed controlled and almost detached, much like the unemotional atmosphere of the trial. The jurors listened attentively, took notes, and submitted questions through the court. The case's strength came from the weight of the evidence presented, not from emotional appeals. After the closing arguments, the jury deliberated for a short time. Court records show they reached a unanimous verdict. Robert Seth Denton was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict was delivered quietly. Denton showed no visible reaction, and the prosecution did not celebrate. There was only a sense of finality. The sentencing would happen at a later date. Denton faced life imprisonment with no chance of parole for taking 3 lives. A future was decided. However, the story didn't conclude with the verdict in the courtroom. After the verdict, the courtroom emptied, but the damage did not. For the families connected to the Henson Road house, the trial's conclusion marked an ending only in legal terms. Emotionally, the impact remained suspended in time. According to victim impact statements and post-trial reporting, the loss was not singular, it was layered. 3 adults were gone, and 6 children were left to carry what they had seen. The children were placed into new homes, separated from the space where the violence occurred. According to court testimony, trauma specialists were involved early. Their lives continued, but under a different gravity. The ordinary markers of childhood school, birthdays, routine, were reshaped by memory. Not memory as narrative, but memory as image. Investigators and counselors alike acknowledge that witnessing violence at that scale alters development in ways that cannot be measured by court outcomes. Extended family members spoke quietly after the trial. There were no public accusations, no calls for harsher punishment. According to statements reported in local media, their focus was on protection and stability for the surviving children. The goal was not revenge, it was containment, keeping the past from claiming more of the future. Bristol is not a city that absorbs violence easily. The case circulated for years, not because of its mystery, but because of its proximity. This was not a crime committed by a stranger passing through. It came from inside a home. That reality left the community uneasy, forcing a reckoning with how violence can exist quietly, without public warning. For the families, grief did not resolve into clarity. There was no explanation that could justify the loss. According to counselors who later spoke about similar cases, unanswered why questions often linger longer than anger. In this case, a motive had been suggested, but never fully understood. Resentment, conflict, emotional fracture. None of it explained the final act in a way that brought peace. The legal system had done what it could. It identified the responsible party. It imposed a sentence. But justice, in its procedural form, does not heal witnesses. It does not erase images. It does not restore a sense of safety. As time passed and the case faded from headlines, one truth remained. The consequences of violence extend far beyond the defendant. They settle into families, into communities, into childhoods that no longer belong entirely to the future. A conviction ends a trial, but it does not always end a case. After Denton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the legal process shifted into a quieter phase. According to court records, Denton pursued post-conviction relief through the appellate system, a standard path for defendants facing permanent incarceration. The focus moved away from the facts of the crime and toward the integrity of the process that produced the verdict. The appeals did not argue that the killings had not occurred. They did not introduce new suspects. Instead, they questioned the procedure, whether Denton received effective legal representation, whether certain testimony should have been limited, whether aspects of the trial met constitutional standards. These arguments, according to appellate filings, were technical and narrow, aimed at potential legal error rather than factual innocence. Appellate judges reviewed transcripts, motions, and rulings from the original trial. The standard was high. A conviction is not overturned because a trial was imperfect. It is overturned only if an error is shown to have altered the outcome. According to published decisions, the courts found no such error in Denton's case. The evidence presented at trial was deemed overwhelming. The testimony of eyewitnesses, corroborated by forensic findings, remained intact under review. Emotionally, this phase of the case unfolded almost invisibly to the public. There were no packed courtrooms, no witnesses called to testify again. For the families of the victims, the appeals reopened wounds without offering resolution. Each filing was a reminder that the case, though settled in verdict, was still alive in law. Denton remained incarcerated throughout the process. He did not testify publicly during appeals. According to legal documents, no new evidence emerged that challenged the core findings of the original investigation. Petitions were denied. Rulings were affirmed. One by one, the avenues narrowed. From an investigative perspective, the appeals reinforced what had already been established. The case did not rest on a single piece of evidence that could be dislodged. It was layered. Eyewitness accounts, ballistics, scene reconstruction, absence of alternative explanations. Even under adversarial review, the structure held. Yet the existence of appeals underscores a larger truth. The justice system allows for doubt. Even after conviction, it builds space for review, not because every verdict is wrong, but because the cost of error is irreversible. In this case, the reviews ended where they began, with the same conclusion. As the legal doors closed one by one, the case moved toward its final chapter. Not in court, but in consequence. When all appeals are exhausted and the law falls silent, what lessons remain for the world outside the prison walls?